Hello and welcome to the conference session, Mind the Gap, exploring the role of diversity and racial equity in Lingley Staff Foundations. My name is Brendan McCormick and I'm Exponent Philanthropy's Manager of Research and Education.
And I'm Afia Mobiasechi, Director of Equity and Inclusion here at Exponent Philanthropy.
In this conference session, we'll be discussing Exponent Philanthropy's new publication titled Mind the Gap, exploring the role of diversity and racial equity in Lingley Staff Foundations. We'll start by going over the publication, covering some of the key data points and highlights, and then Afia will facilitate a conversation with two Exponent Philanthropy Foundation members featured in that publication.
Overall, we just want to remind everyone that there is no set blueprint when it comes to embracing racial equity work, but understanding what's at play with the data that we have, having examples, it's a critical part to taking the next steps towards being more equitable. So we all have a role to play.
Awesome, sounds great. And with that, let's jump into a few quick slides. So this publication has been in the works for quite some time. It started out as a way for us to focus on the data Exponent Philanthropy collects each year and reports in our foundation operations and management report. Over the past few years, we've collected data on board and staff demographics, foundation practices tied to racial equity, and we've looked at how grant-making practices are tied to a foundation's approach to racial equity. We wanted to share all that information in one place and have a clear narrative around that data. As we worked on the report, it became clear that an understanding of the demographic makeup of foundation and boards and staff is important context, but it's even more important for funders to really reflect on if, why, and how their work has come to contribute to this demographic disparity in philanthropy. There's no one way to approach this problem, and there's no simple right answer or next step for foundations to take. Instead, we encourage you to take the time with your board and staff members to really reflect. With that reflection element in mind, we also released a discussion guide alongside of this publication to help you navigate that process. Later on, you'll hear from two funders as they reflect on some of those topics today. But for now, let's dive into the data to set the scene for us. So, why racial equity at lead foundations? Some research done by the Bridgespan Group and Echoing Green that came out last summer found that there are two primary factors holding back philanthropy's effort to help advance social change that are rooted in race. The first is understanding the role of race in the problems that philanthropists are trying to solve. And the second is the significance of race when it comes to how philanthropists identify leaders and find solutions. So in a nutshell, a lack of diversity is holding back funders from making a bigger impact. So let's jump into the data we've got on foundation demographics. We looked at the entire population of board members of the foundations that participated in our annual survey, and we compared those numbers to the overall US population. We found that while white people make up 60% of the US population, they make up 90% of foundation board members. And conversely, people of color make up about 40% of the US population, but only 10% of foundation board members. Now, looking at the composition of individual foundation boards, we found that 72% of foundation boards are all white, 12% of boards have one person of color, 13% of foundations have more than one person of color on their board, and only 3% of foundations have boards that are made up entirely of people of color. One key trend that we wanted to be sure and highlight is that as the overall board size increases, the number of black board members also tends to increase. So it's clear that kind of having a larger board, really more seats at the table, allows you to increase the diversity of your board. Now, switching gears to look at staff demographics, we looked at foundation demographics by both gender and race, and we found that 60% of foundation staff are white females. You can see the other demographic breakdown here, but it's really far and away white females are the vast majority of foundation staff. Looking at the staff demographics at each staff level, we can see that only 11% of foundation CEOs identified as people of color. And you can see the demographics for professional grant-making staff and administrative support staff on screen here.
Yeah, I think what I wanted to highlight that there are huge disparities here, right? We see that, we recognize that in the numbers, especially when considering many of our members operate with few or no staff. And so thinking about these demographics, You may feel a sense of limitation, but also remember that there's no limit to your mission and how you're giving and what impact you want to make.
I think those are great points. Thanks, Sophia. Now I want to switch gears and as we move away from demographics and look at how racial equity is tied to our members' missions. Um, so in our survey, we defined racial equity as the systematic fair treatment of all people of all races that results in equitable outcomes and opportunities for everyone. We asked funders on a scale of 1 to 10 how relevant racial equity was to their missions, and you see the results on screen here. In our data, we did see an increase in the percentage of foundations that saw racial equity as somewhat or very relevant to their work from 2019 to 2020. In our 2020 survey, nearly 3/4 of foundations saw racial equity as somewhat or very relevant to their work. There's a lot more data in the report that I really encourage you to dig into, but one key point to emphasize is that funders that saw racial equity as very relevant to their work were more likely to engage in each and every race equity practice we asked about. Some of those practices we've got here on screen, there are lots of other practices to dig into and learn more about. And now for our last section, we'll look at how grant-making practices are related to racial equity. Funders that view racial equity as somewhat or very relevant to their work are more likely to engage in what we call catalytic philanthropic practices. These are practices lean funders use to make an outsized impact in their communities. Some of the practices that are included in this are funding community organizing, engaging constituents in your grant-making processes, collaborating with other funders, and meeting with policymakers and politicians to educate them about your mission area. These are great ways to make an outsized impact. In addition to these funding practices, we also found that foundations that rated racial equity as very relevant to their mission were more likely to fund target populations such as the economically disadvantaged, ethnic or racial minorities, immigrants, migrants, or refugees, and the LGBTQIA+ community. Sophia, any reflections on this section of the data?
Yeah, I mean, this section really excites me because to me, it really reveals all of the ways that philanthropy can make an impact. And thinking about how do we want to tackle funding and tackle systemic changes within the community that we seek to serve. So what you touched on are all the keystones to grant-making practices at the intersection of philanthropy, and what it means to me and many of you all, I believe, is community, collaboration, and connection. And by offering more general operating support, capacity building support, multi-year grants, you can really help your grantee partners fulfill these desired goals of how do we really advance racial equity.
Yeah, all great points. Those are such powerful grant-making strategies to take advantage of. So I just want to, as we move on from this final section, just really summarize kind of the key takeaways from this data that you should be reflecting on. Nearly 3 in 4 members see race equity as somewhat or very relevant to their work, but only 1 in 4 members have any Black, Indigenous, or people of color represented on their board or staffs. This is a really significant gap to be aware of, and we all need to reflect on if, why, and how our work is contributing to this demographic disparity. As we continue to engage in racial equity work, we really encourage our members and funders to listen, be humble, be curious, and really focus on continual learning. But thankfully, these are characteristics we know lean funders possess in droves. So we're confident in lean funders' ability to step up to the occasion. Here we have some just initial questions for you to reflect on. There are plenty more in the publication and reflection guide. So I encourage you to take the time to dig into these questions, think about how you can make your foundation's internal and external practices more equitable. But now let's switch gears away from this data and hear more from 2 members about how they've worked to incorporate racial equity into their foundation's work. Sophia, let's take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brendan. And Marsha, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the group.
Great. I'm Marsha Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Zedek Social Justice Fund. We're based in Asheville, North Carolina, where we distribute money, resources, and power to support systems change and community healing, specifically around the focal areas of racial justice, LGBTQ justice, and combating anti-Semitism. We're really glad to be here.
And my name is David Greco. I'm the executive director of All Stars Helping Kids. We are based in Santa Clara, California, and we fund emerging nonprofits. These are small startup nonprofits. We provide 3 years of general operating support, training, capacity building, coaching, and connecting them to other peer and funding networks. Our areas are access to education, career readiness, and health and wellness. And all of our programs focus on disadvantaged youth living in low-income communities.
Nice. Thanks, David. Thanks, Marsha. We're so happy to have you all here. And so with that, let's get into some questions. So as you know, this session is all about Minding the Gap. And this is a publication that we've developed around diversity and racial equity in Leavely staff foundations. So our survey has shown a lot of data with clear relationship between the focus of racial equity and good grant making and governance practices. So my first question, and let's start with David, is how are you continuously connecting racial equity to the foundation's mission?
And I think there's 3 different levels of that for us, at least. One is organization, right? We're looking at the board, our staff, and I think there we've done a fairly good job. I think there are some gaps we're still identifying, particularly because, again, we're here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so when we think about diversity and inclusion, there's a wide range of different cultures and communities we're trying to incorporate into that mix. And so I think organizationally, we've hired some new staff. We've been very intentional and very thoughtful about those communities that the staff represent. So I think that's one level. And then I think when we're actually even selecting the organizations that we work with, we're very thoughtful about, I think 80+% of our grantees are led by people of color or LGBTQ, community members. And so I think that's really kind of been thoughtful. And then, of course, we're looking at the youth that those nonprofits serve as well. And what are the communities they're from. And so I think from all 3 levels, I think we've made a real intention. I think if there's still kind of ways to go is being able to try to track and measure that. That's always the challenge, right? So I think organizationally we can tell, okay, how many board members we have, what our staff looks like. But in terms of, even looking at the staff of our grantees, the board members, the representation on those organizations, which was a new part that we kind of added into our application process this year, was actually asking about the kind of breakdown of their board members, for example, to kind of get some better data around that. And then, of course, looking at the youth that they're serving. So we've tried to incorporate it across all 3 levels. I'll be the first to tell you it's a work in progress, but our founders, our board is just very, very committed to this work. I think we've always historically, by the nature of focusing on disadvantaged youth living in low-income communities, you're going to be hitting certain demographics anyway. But I think being much more explicit and much more thoughtful, not just about, oh, okay, yes, the youth that they serve, but looking at things like their board, their staff of our grantees to make sure that we really are being as diverse and inclusive as we possibly can.
Yeah, and I'll chime in. I mean, I think I love, David, how you broke that down into multiple levels. I mean, that's been our experience here at Zedek as well. Our original, I mean, from the founding of our fund, we've always focused on our LGBTQ justice and racial justice and combating anti-Semitism, but we've mostly looked at the racial justice efforts of our grantees. It's most recently that we started to think about, wait, there are additional levels here, and we needed to start looking internally and figuring out what's happening in our organization. And for us, the key point was defining what racial equity meant to us. And that racial equity for us, as opposed to diversity and inclusion, meant shared decision-making power. And so that's kind of our phrase that we use to help us really analyze, like kind of a quick rule of thumb. How do I know that we're stepping into racial equity? Well, are the people that we're bringing in actually having decision-making power over, our strategy, our grant making, and those types of pieces? So, I think our grantee partners have always been a diverse body, but what's emerged in the last 3 to 5 years is we have a small staff of 5 at this point. There were just 4 when I first came on, and I was the first person of color on the staff. It was all white women, and we've transitioned now to 2 of our 5. And I mean, and I granted 2 out of 5 doesn't sound like a huge number, but it's 40% of a very lean team, right? And it definitely makes a difference in the dynamic. But for us, it was incredibly important to say, not only are we bringing staff of color into the mix, but they're staff of color who actually have critical decision-making power. And then we shifted the same on our board as well. Our board, prior to January 2021, just consisted of our funder and founder, Amy Mandel, and another staff member. And we've shifted because we thought, okay, decision-making power, where is power held in our organization? And definitely the board is where is the crux of the power is, especially in terms of determining our overall strategy. And so we shifted to actually now having a board of 8 local community leaders who are based in Asheville, who are doing work in our focal areas. And their job is to really help manage our overall strategy, and really also to kind of make sure that we're not implementing things that are toxic to community. Philanthropy is not always linked into what the impact is of our dollars on the ground. And so these community leaders are not just saying, here's where we think you should go, but they're also saying, please don't go here. Like, how do we make sure that we keep folks protected? And one of the things that blossomed out of that, we definitely intentionally recruited for a diverse board. But we feel pretty lucky that 7 out of 8 of the folks on our board now are women of color. And so that diversification process has happened. But for us, it's more important, the equity piece is making sure that they actually have not just, like they're not just figureheads for the organization, that they're actually making true decisions, including whether or not I get to keep my job, right? So I feel like that's a very fundamental piece. But, along with that, we've also shifted our grant making priorities. So in 2020, 90% of our grant making dollars, our organizational grant making dollars, went to organizations that were involved in racial justice, and 51% were led by the people who are most impacted by those systemic oppressions. And that phrase, again, most impacted, again, is what we use to kind of as a rule of thumb in terms of thinking which organizations we prioritize. We prioritize organizations that are led by folks who are most impacted by anti-Semitism, LGBTQ injustice, and racial injustice. And it's been I will echo what David said, it's definitely a work in progress, but for us, it's felt like a very, the benefits outweigh the risks and the challenges around that process.
And Marcia, I think you're spot on. I love that because I think the shared decision making. There's a couple things I think that's really interesting about that. One is a couple of years ago we were looking to kind of retool and tighten up our accelerator program and our trainings and our capacity building work for our nonprofits. So we went out to them and said, well, what do you guys need? What are you missing? What's most helpful? And we really kind of incorporated their feedback and their input into the process. And also the same thing happened in March of 2020, as COVID was just starting to shut everything down. We were trying to think of, okay, we need, all of our grantees that had fall galas, everything got canceled. We have a lot of school-based programs that all of a sudden got shut down. So we were trying to figure out how do we respond? And same thing, we went back out to our grantees and said, what would be most helpful? And they said, we need money to keep the doors open and the lights on. Great. We put a rapid response, working capital, general operating support, keep the lights on, keep the doors open, give them that breathing. We talked about how do we give them that breathing room so they can adapt their programming as they're trying to deal with everything that's happening in an incredibly rapidly moving environment. And I think, for us, mean, one of the things is, even as diverse as we can make our staff, same thing. We're only 5 or 6 people. We just don't have the same, there's going to be gaps. We just don't have all the same experiences that our grantees bring to the table. And so they were bringing in things that we hadn't even seen. Oh, that's totally missed that and didn't even think about that. And so it was really, I thought, I always think that, bringing in the people that are most impacted by the kind of decisions always leads to better decisions anyway.
Right.
But when we really brought them in, then when we launched both our new accelerator program and our rapid response fund during COVID, they were just, I want to say they were major hits, but they really, I think, were much more successful launches than if we had just sat in a room. Even again, as diverse as our internal team is, we would have missed things. And so I think really hearing from the communities and really thinking about what it is that what they're really seeing and hearing and needing on the ground was just. It just led to, it really led, and the other thing that it did, not only did it lead to, I think, a lot of great programs, but it really helped, I think, build a lot of trust between a relatively new team. I'd been for 2 years. Our program director came on like a week before I did, and so we were relatively new, and they really, after that, they really felt that then as we moved and started to do other work, again, when we reached out, there was a much better good line of communications. And then folks started to really feel comfortable bringing stuff to our attention. Even on this, we just closed our most recent grant window that just closed at the end of August. And again, even for some of the groups that came back, they said, oh, well, you have these 2 questions here and, this doesn't really apply. And we're like, oh, wow, that's some good feedback. And so even it's almost become now almost a very real-time feedback loop, which is great. And it shows a level of trust that our grantees have in us. But again, I think, to me, it just leads to better decisions and better programs and better outcomes all around. So I know even if you take away all of the diversity and equity kind of lens from it, just from an organizational decision-making process, it's just a much better way to do decision-making.
Yes. I'm so glad that you're pointing that out, because I think there was so much like tentativeness in our team as we started engaging in our racial equity process around like, ooh, what do we do if it doesn't go right? And it turns out that when you're in relationship with community in a very real and authentic way, that it's like being in a relationship with friends, right? I mean, they're more likely to be able to deal with the ups and downs and maybe the flubs that emerge because you're in a larger authentic relationship. And we went through a similar process, David, around getting community feedback. We actually, we called it a pause for the cause. So our organizational grant making continued, but we had programming that we paused while we did a community research process. And that was one of the questions we asked. Is it possible for us as funders to be co-conspirators in the fight for liberation? Can we actually be seen as a partner in this work and not just someone who funds the work? And if that's the case, what do you need from us in order to trust that we can be worthy partners in this? And the feedback we got was so beautiful, and we fundamentally shifted our organization. So the program that we had on pause actually didn't come back because no one said we need this program. What they said, they really wanted less leadership development, professional development, and more just straight general operating support, right? For multiple years that they could rely on and actually make their own decisions about in terms of where it's going. And we also received quite a bit of feedback that caused us to kind of revamp our mission and vision to use the language that our grantee partners use to talk about their own work, right? And so it became all of a sudden like, we are now learning to speak their language. So when we talk about redistributing wealth, power, and resources to support systems change, that literally we pulled that from our community research report, because that's how our grantee partners are talking about their work, right? It's systems change work. And it's redistributing power and resources and funds that were inequitably distributed from the beginning, right? And so it was really a fascinating process for us to go from talking about our philanthropy in kind of a more in a way that we didn't realize was disempowering. We were talking about our work as in ways that almost made it feel like charity. Like, we are coming in as the saviors with the wealth and with the expertise to come save you, community people. Aren't you lucky that we're in your sphere, right? And there was so much about the feedback that made it really clear to us, one, that wealth does not equal expertise, that because we have the funds doesn't mean that we know best what needs to happen in our community, but also that we really wanted to be in right relationship with our grantee partners. And what that meant was realizing what we're bringing to the table are financial resources and connections to the larger philanthropic world. And what they're bringing is actually expertise about how do you shift your community from one point to another. And there isn't and if we're doing this right, there shouldn't be a huge power differential there, right? That they're coming in with almost the expert that, you would, the expertise that you would pay a consultant thousands of dollars for, and that we often ask for their time for free, right? And we often, treat them as though you don't really know what you're talking about in terms of money. And here we are as the large, it's our largesse that's allowing us to fund you. And we're getting into a point now where we're like, how do we honor the fact that we are actually in relationship with each other? That we both our grantee partners and ourselves are really, really interested in liberation for all people. And if the goal is this liberation for all people, then how do we work in collaboration in a way that honors the wealth that both of us bring, both parties bring to the table? But I think that's a conversation we could only engage in because of community feedback, right? And listening to what folks had to say about philanthropy, how they feel about philanthropy, and in their dream world, what would they want a funder to do? And we were really, while this process was going on of us getting the community research feedback, there was also a parallel process happening internally around us building our analysis and our understanding of philanthropy, of the nonprofit industrial complex, of what these inequities are that we're talking about. And it's that building actually is what allowed our funder and founder to be able to say, you know what, I feel safe taking a step back, A, because I know that my team understands what's going on, but B, because I'm realizing now, given what I understand about philanthropy and the role that philanthropy has had in the development of our society, and that wealth is really coming off of, like, her family's ability to hoard wealth came out of really inequitable policies. And so her realizing that it's important to step back, to honor, again, to be in right relationship with where this money came from and what work is emerging in community. And I'm saying all of that to highlight, I think that your report brings up reflection and the importance of reflection in this work. And this is not just about like policy shifts or the operationalizing of a grant making application. There's actually some real internal work that needed to happen within our organization for us to say, like, what is our relationship to money? What are the unspoken expectations we have when we give a grant to an organization? And for our funder and founder, it was the real question of, what is my relationship to money? What is my relationship to power? How do I feel about sharing decision-making power? So those are the kind of questions that I think may feel a little bit more woo-woo for folks. Like, they may not realize that it's important to pause for them, but I found that those were critical in terms of ensuring that we weren't just making shifts in name only, but we were making really fundamental shifts in how we were viewing our role and our position in our community.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I do. And it's funny because I would think one of the reasons that I'm even here today kind of talking about this is, I think as a result of that feedback we've gotten from our grantees. One of the things when we reached out to them and said, hey, what's working with our program? What would you like to see changed? And the feedback was really very consistent. Like that, we love the money, don't get us wrong, general operating support, but they're like, it's all that other stuff that you do. It's the capacity building, it's the training, it's the connection, it's the, oh, you made an introduction to this funder for us, and now we got a $200,000 grant from them, and that's great. Or things like that. And so they really started to say, oh, how can you, I wish you could get other funders to do similar work. I wish you could get other funders to kind of do it the way you're doing it. And we really kind of started to, first we were like, oh, that's great, thanks, that's nice, but then we really started to think about that. And then we started to see, as our grantees were trying to struggle with kind of the institutional philanthropy, right? And their kind of old school practices that we still have a lot of. And so one of our grantees in particular, really came to us and was like, you guys have a seat at the table. You're already a funder. You're a member of Exponent and the regional associations of grant makers. You're there. Like we don't have access to that group to kind of push changes in grant making policies and procedures and things like that. And so they really asked us. One really challenged us and said, "Listen, that's part of what we need from you." Is that you're great, but there's all these other funders that we're getting funding from, and that we're getting 1 year restricted program grant, no overheads, no capacity, they're not paying for all this stuff. And it's like, you need to beat the drum on particularly for these groups that are smaller, community-based organizations on the front lines of these communities, really doing the heavy lift of racial equity and social justice work, right? Those groups in particular, and they're like, I think we've all been in philanthropy enough that there's a tendency in philanthropy to just throw money at a problem, right? We think we just let's throw $100 million at racial equity and that, okay, good. Now we're done. We can all go back our merry ways. And it takes more than that to really get this work done. And I think that's what we were hearing from our grantees. And so we really started to, whether we call it a program area or not, but really said, okay, we do have a responsibility now to kind of use whatever pulpit we have to help advance, not just us, because if we can get other funders to start changing how they think and how they fund and support these groups in particular, right? Because they're not, we're dealing with groups that are $140,000 budgets, but they're doing like the work they're doing on the ground is just mind-blowingly incredible. But they don't have the theory of change and a logic model and 3 years of audits and financial sustainability plans and They don't have all of that, and so they're just getting excluded. From we're just wiping out a whole group of nonprofits. In some cases, the very, very groups that we want to be funding, right? The very, very groups that really are doing the exact work that we're trying to achieve in these communities. And so we really got pushed by our groups to start taking a more public profile on that, which was not something as an organization and as a board and our founder, that was just not, that wasn't how they really thought about their work. And so introducing this now, we're kind of thought leadership idea and really getting out and speaking and being much more public and being much more explicit about this work. That was a real kind of shift that started because of that feedback. And it kind of introduced a whole new set of work for us that we had not really been thinking about. And for us, I mean, again, that's a new area where we're kind of taking this on. But I think it's almost like we're taking this on behalf of what we're really hearing from our groups and these nonprofits in the local communities. So I think it has really introduced and shifted how we've done programs on a whole variety of different levels that I don't think we would never have done that if we hadn't really either heard the feedback or been open to that feedback.
It's hilarious.
I know they probably have
I can just keep going. I'm sorry. If you want to interrupt with another question, go for it.
I love this. I mean, I'm hearing a lot about listening, building trust, all of these things that really are about the human aspect of what it is to work towards equity, And so I love this. I am here for everything you guys have talked about. One thing that comes to mind is thinking about the lessons learned, right? So, I think we've all talked about how this work is evolving and, we don't have the answers and we're listening and we're evolving and we're changing and we're ebbing and we're flowing. And so are there any things that come to mind of, we tried this and it didn't quite work, but we learned something from it? Anything that really comes to mind of like an aha moment of, oh, we've been doing that like this, let's do it differently. I know you guys touched on how you've been evolving and listening and hearing, but anything that just like a story that comes to mind that you can think of?
I think one of the things that has emerged for us is we believe pretty deeply in trust-based philanthropy. All of our practices are in alignment with that platform. And at least that's what we're moving towards. And one of the principles of trust-based philanthropy is to have less burdensome applications and reporting and that piece. And one of the pieces that we've started is bringing in community leaders to be part of participatory grant making processes, right? Where we give them a bucket of funds and they're making the decisions about where that needs to go. One of the things that has emerged for us is realizing that while we have had 2 to 3 years to really talk through analysis and to talk through, the practices of philanthropy, and even if you bring in folks who have those values at the core of their work, there's something really interesting that emerges when folks are deciding what to do with money. And it's interesting that what starts to come up is everyone's old stories and old ideas about who's deserving, who's worthy, how do we decide who's worthy? And we've, and this has happened with both our staff and the participatory grant making, in some of our other participatory processes, where the first try actually sometimes looks a lot like conventional philanthropy, because everyone's like, well, we need to have this and we need to have this, and are you sure that person really deserves money? And so there's this moment where and granted, you want to be rigorous, right, in terms of deciding who's getting funds, but one of the things that we've really started to work on is, one, actually spending time to say, which of these practices do we need to dismantle? And what are our beliefs around money that we need to kind of unpack in order for us to feel safe being able to give money in a way that's less burdensome, that doesn't require 20 questions that aren't really relevant to the work, but you're asking because you're just kind of so nervous about giving away money. And so the analogy I needed to make, I mean, this is true about our funds, but I don't know if it is for everyone's, funding sources, money sources. But one of the things I had to make clear both to myself and to our team was to kind of understand our fund in perspective with the larger amount of wealth that is available in this world and how wealth typically works in this world. In particular, we talk about like coins, and they're coins in a couch cushion. That in terms of our fund and what that money means in relationship to her family's money, what she can do for herself, what she needs to support her family. The money that we give out, while it feels really large to our grantees, is actually, in perspective with her wealth, is actually the coins in the couch cushion, right? That we could give it out to the wrong person, and based on how wealth kind of continues to kind of reperpetuate itself, that next year we would still have, $2 million to give away. And so given that, why are we holding this with such a white knuckle grip? And what is this fear we have and this imagining we have that trusting organizations is kind of this large risk that we're taking as a funder? It's actually not. The larger risk that we're taking as a funder is to stay with the status quo, is to stay with how funds are usually given out. That for me is the larger risk, because we've seen, and I think your report really shows really brilliantly, the ways in which that's not always always effective, right? I mean, you're pointing and you highlight the ways in which most of funds and are white-led organizations giving mostly to white-led organizations, right? That is the status quo. And for me, it feels much, much riskier for us to continue to lean into those practices and to continue to not make the change that we need to make than it does for us to think about, all right, well, how do we make it easier for us to give funds to more of these grassroots organizations like David was talking about, that have these smaller budgets, but not only smaller budgets, they're usually started by people who already have full-time jobs. They're doing this on the side to fulfill a need in their community. And they're not thinking about, how do I write the next grant? They're thinking about, how do I do the work? And so how do we take on the burden and the onus of making sure that application is complete and let them do what they do best? And so I guess for us, the biggest, I mean, I wouldn't say flub, but it was a learning, is realizing even despite your best intentions, you may create something that is still wildly inequitable. And so being ready to kind of look back at your work and reevaluate, and to not be discouraged by that, to actually realize you kind of need to do that first try to get all of those things out of your system, and then you know, kind of to move on to the more innovative type of grant making that we'd like to see.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, if we could go on for so. I was getting so
Yes.
excited. My wife was talking, I was like, oh yes, yeah, that too. But one of the things, and I think she used the word about this rigorous process, and I think that's part of it too, because you know we're very concerned to make sure, can we measure our outcomes, can we evaluate this, can we say this definitely works better than some other processes. But I think one of the things that kind of got lost in that process as we start to try and institutionalize everything and have, you know, the you know, clear and transparent process, is there's still a lot of informal stuff that has to happen, right? There's still like, you know, a grantee will just call and be like, I'm having a problem with this or something on my board. This issue's going on, right? Yes, we could say, okay, well, here, you know, we have this intranet platform that they can go and they can request, you know, a coach and or advisor, and they can do that. But they're like, I just need 10 minutes of your time. I just need a half hour. And even during the application process, even as we open that up, like one of the things that we did is our program director, she's available. And so if there's questions, people actually can call her and actually get her on the phone. And they're all like, wait a minute, what? I can actually talk to a program officer? That's like crazy town, right? So I think one of the things we learned was that, yes, it's great to have all these processes and as open and as inclusive and all that you can make those do. You have to still account for, I think, some of that kind of more informal kind of just community, you know, back and forth. And how do we also gain, everything doesn't, you know, sometimes these formal processes don't always get you the information that you actually really need. And so a lot of sometimes the feedback that we've gotten and some of the real, I think, gems about, oh my God, we're just realizing there's a whole gap in our programming is from somebody just calling and just saying, hey, I have a problem. Can we talk about this? And I'm like, ooh, wow, that's okay. We've never had that come up. So now how are we going to figure out this? And that has been really, really rich. But as we grow and as we're moving and we're trying to do all of this work, how do we keep that in that process to where we really are? Yes, we have the formal mechanisms in our surveys, I know this, and our feedback loops and all of that kind of stuff. But what are those just more informal opportunities that people really have, I think, to share and to gather and to come together and to, you know, I think for us, provide valuable feedback that maybe for whatever reason, either they're not thinking about or just through a formal process that sometimes you just don't collect. So I think that's been one of the balances that I think we've been kind of trying to struggle and to manage, because I think we want to keep those lines of communications open, but at the same time, we still need to, you know, measure our impact and do all of our stuff as well. And so that it's been an interesting learning experience for us on that. And I think one of the things that also, I think, again, going back to this kind of, you know, I think we've had some ideas on some programs that we wanted to try. So we thankfully, and we kind of rolled them out, and we reached out to a couple of grantees, and we were like, okay, we're kind of thinking about that. And they're like, interesting. We're like, all right, that's not going anywhere, is it? They're like, nope, that's not. We misfired on that. So thankfully, I think one of the things that's actually kind of stopped us from misfiring on some of these things is because we've been able to just call up a grantee or reach out to somebody and say, hey, how does this sound? Does that kind of work with you? And then they'll give us some feedback, and we're like, oh, okay, yeah, now we're seeing why that's not going to really work very well. So I think that kind of informal flow of information is something that's really important. I think that kind of really hearing from the people on the street, if you will, I think that still really matters.
I
feel like that's, yeah, I feel like the one comment I wanted to put to that is I want to highlight that because I feel like it's one of the unexpected gifts of racial equity is shared emotional labor. The idea that you no longer have to feel like, wow, you're alone as a funder in terms of making the right decision for your community. These relationships are helpful for us too. So you can call out and say, ooh, all right, maybe this will work, or maybe it won't. And you saved yourself tons of money and staff hours. So it's one of those unexpected gifts, but I think really both deepens your impact and saves you a lot of time and effort in the long run.
Absolutely.
Definitely. I mean, this conversation has been amazing. Like you both said, we could keep going and going and going, but we're running out of time. And so with that, I just want to thank you all. And just remember, there's opportunities to reflect, to be humble and to be curious when we're doing this racial equity work. And you guys have been great examples as members that are really doing this work. So we hope this was inspiring for anyone who's listening, and thank you. Just thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.